voters likely to look at these two in contrast to one another?
Well, they are going to view it through the lens of partisanship, but I think there's also going to be a question of how believable and how empathetic both candidates are in expressing their concerns about where we are with inflation and what their prospective solutions are for it. I can't help but think about the 1992 presidential campaign and the debate question where George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were asked to basically describe how much basic groceries cost, and one was closer than the other in actually being aware of sort of what the standard price was for a gallon of milk or the price of bread. And so while President Trump wants to seize on anxiety about inflation and blame the Biden and by extension the Biden-Harris administration for causing inflation, Vice President Harris's approach tomorrow, we suspect, is going to be to talk about structural issues that actually would put more focus on the market and suggest that it isn't the Inflation Reduction Act, it wasn't any of the COVID rescue plans that really increased inflation, but it was businesses that were taking advantage of, low supply chains and other issues to raise prices and then keep them high unnecessarily. So, I expect Democrats and Republicans are going to respond in kind and sort of root for their team. But I think that there is a question about which of these candidates looks more like they've actually tried to, put a week's worth of meals together for $200 or, actually knows what goes into a grocery list in order to put a casserole together. That might be the one that pulls up at those people in the middle who are still making up their minds.
It is interesting to consider that one of them worked at McDonald's and the other one did not. We were just talking about the gallon of milk moment in 1992, Andra. I don't know if you could relive or replay that now, considering the candidates we're talking about. But part of the reason why Donald Trump is out there and he's got all the prices, if it's not just the food stuffs he's got there, but also big murals or big boards up with prices on them, showing increases over time, showing the price for milk and meat and so forth. This was billed as a news conference, though, and he has not taken a single question yet. Part of the reason why he's doing this is to highlight the fact that Kamala Harris has not held a news conference. What would happen if she did what Donald Trump is doing and never took a single question from reporters?
She would continue to be attacked by Republicans for sure, and there would certainly be grumblings in the press that would likely make their way into mainstream news reports, and then it would just become a question of what people are thinking about. So the idea that this has become a news item means that there may be people who might not have thought about it if it hadn't been mentioned before, who are going to think about it now, and depending on what their priors were in terms of kind of what their previous commitments were and some of what their previous thoughts were, this could actually enhance their opinion of Vice President Harris, or it could actually diminish their opinion of Vice President Harris. Suffice to say, part of the reason why Vice President Harris hasn't taken a news conference yet is because she hasn't had to, and because she's had the luxury of being able to say she was putting a campaign together. But I think the long-term question is, how long can you say, I haven't had time to sit down for a press conference or for an interview without that the excuses about, having to put together a campaign at the last minute start to ring really hollow. So I think that, in due time, she is going to have no choice but to sit down and take questions from people. And then I think the contrast will be, how does she respond to questions in the same manner and with the same type of bravado that Donald Trump does? Because while Donald Trump has subjected himself to interviews and has answered questions, he's also been combative at times when it hasn't been helpful to him. And he's also answered questions in outrageous ways that actually also are a distraction from, I think, the main point of his campaign, or at least what his handlers would prefer that he say.
Yeah, certainly you're seeing more Republicans outwardly criticizing his lack of discipline, if you will, even the likes of Vivek Ramaswamy, who has been a big advocate of his. Also, when we consider the decision making on the Harris campaign to expose herself to the press and ad-lib opportunities or not, you could see the argument that might suggest that she already is doing well enough, or at least comparatively better than Biden was at this point without that. If you take a look at the latest research from Pew, shows her leading point 1 point up against Donald Trump nationally among registered voters, 46 to 45. But what I found so interesting is you look at the minority demographics here. Andra, 77% of black voters said they are supporting or leaning toward Harris, compared to 64% who said the same about Biden just weeks ago. Hispanic voters favor Harris over Trump by a 17-point margin. In July, Biden and Trump were tied among Hispanic voters. What do you see happening here?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of factors at play. Part of it is the enthusiasm gap. So we've seen enthusiasm increase amongst voters, Democratic voters in general, and voters of color who are more likely to be Democratic than Republican voters. There were concerns about Biden's age, that people didn't necessarily have an outlet to be able to vent. And now that age has been taken off of the table for the Democratic nominee, there are people who are more comfortable aligning themselves with the Democratic candidate. Some of this could be, a bit of a bandwagon effect, if you will. So there were folks who were really concerned about Joe Biden's prospects for being able to win the election. And as we have seen the trend line move in a more positive direction with Harris on the ticket, Democratic voters who might have been reluctant to support a ticket that they didn't think was going to win now feel a little bit more buoyed and enthusiastic about this ticket. And that's being expressed in their stated intent to turn out and also what their vote choice is. So the question is that it's still August. There's still plenty of time for people to change their minds and become dispirited. So the Harris campaign is going to have to maintain this momentum, and they're going to have to keep the spirits of their voters up. And make sure that they translate that enthusiasm into actual votes on election day. So mobilization is going to still be critical at this particular point. This race is still, too close to call, and both sides are going to have to put their level best effort in to make sure that they find every possible voter to get them to turn out to vote.
Well, I'm just wondering if we're going to have one less to talk about at some point soon, Andra. There's reporting today. First, the Washington Post and others followed. RFK Jr. sought a meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris to discuss endorsing her in exchange for a cabinet position. He has since publicly said that he is not interested in being part of a Harris administration, but these reports are still out there, and I wonder if you see his campaign, particularly now that he may not be on the ballot, it appears, in New York, winding down now.
Well, I mean, his candidacy was always a long shot candidacy. The question of ballot access is certainly really important in terms of, trying to gauge his actual success at actually being able to, in theory, be able to win 270 electoral college votes, which was always called into question. I think the larger question was, could he play spoiler? And with two very unpopular candidates at the top of the ticket in Joe Biden and Donald Trump, there was, a possibility that he could be more likely to play spoiler than other third-party candidates have played. So with Biden out of the race and Harris in, we've seen some of his support shift to the two major party candidates, because this isn't a sort of question of like having two sort of similarly matched in age and similarly matched in favorability candidates. And so people have clearer preferences there. And so it makes his third party candidacy sort of lose a little bit of its salience. And then that's compounded by the organizational mistakes, the fact that his family doesn't support him, and the fact that you're hearing these stories, founded or unfounded, but that actually kind of contribute to questions about his temperament and readiness to actually serve in any public capacity.